Probate attorney kept glancing at my shoes. I noticed it 3 times before the hearing even started. That quick flicker downward, the almost invisible smirk he tried to hide behind his legal pad. My son-in-law was sitting across the conference table in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my truck payment, and his attorney was the kind of man who wore cufflinks on a Tuesday morning. They both looked at me the way people look at something that doesn't belong in the room. I was wearing my green Carhartt jacket, the one with the frayed left cuff. I'd had it since 2009. I didn't say anything. I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table and waited for the mediator to call the session to order. My daughter was sitting 2 seats down from her husband, staring at her hands. She wouldn't look at me. That was the part that cost me sleep the night before. Not the money, not the years of work about to be picked apart by strangers, but the fact that my own daughter was sitting on the other side of the table. But I need you to understand how we got here, because it didn't start in that conference room. It started 31 years earlier, on a Tuesday morning in October, when I drove a used flatbed truck onto a 40-acre parcel of scrubland outside Knoxville, Tennessee. With $11,000 in savings and a handwritten business plan I worked on at the kitchen table every night for 2 years. My name is George Whitfield. I'm 64 years old, and I spent the better part of my adult life building a logistics and warehousing company from nothing. Not venture capital, nothing. Not family money, nothing. I mean, I worked at a distribution center for 16 years and saved every dollar nothing. My wife passed in 2019. Breast cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Her name was Ruth, and she was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday of every person she'd ever met, who kept a handwritten card file in the kitchen drawer organized by month. After she died, the house got very quiet. I kept working because it was the only thing I knew how to do that felt like it meant something. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is. Whatever happened after, had married a man named Dominic Farrell about 4 years before Ruth passed. He was 38, a commercial real estate developer out of Atlanta, and he had the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted himself a single day in his life, which isn't necessarily a flaw, but it was how he carried it with everyone else that I started to notice over time. He talked over Ruth at the dinner table. Not loudly, not rudely, just smoothly, the way water redirects around a stone. She would start a sentence and somehow, by the end of it, he was finishing a different one. She mentioned it to me once, laughing it off. I filed it away and didn't say anything. After she died, I filed away a few more things. He suggested at the estate planning meeting I held 6 months after Ruth's passing that the smartest move would be to fold my company into an LLC structured under a family trust. He had a lawyer he recommended. Very sharp, he said. Handles arrangements like this all the time. I said I'd think about it. What I did instead was call my own attorney, a woman named Patsy who'd handled my business contracts for 15 years, and ask her to look into the arrangement he was describing. She called me back 2 days later and said, "George, I'd like you to come in and sit down with me," which is attorney speak for something's wrong. The structure Dominic's lawyer was proposing would have given him, as a co-trustee, effective co-management authority over the operating company. My daughter would have been listed as primary beneficiary, which sounded fine on paper, except that under Tennessee trust law at the time, the co-trustee had broad discretionary authority over distributions and investment decisions. Patsy put it plainly. Within 5 years, you'd be the figurehead and he'd be running your company. I thanked her, went home, and sat in the kitchen for a long time. I didn't confront him. I want to be clear about that because people always ask why I didn't just say something. And the honest answer is that I'd spent 30 years in business, and I'd learned a long time ago that when someone is working a slow angle on you, the worst thing you can do is let them know you see it, because then they get careful. And careful people are much harder to deal with than overconfident ones. So I said nothing. I told him the attorney had recommended I wait until the estate was fully settled, which was true, and I watched. Over the next 18 months, I watched a lot. I watched him gently position himself as my advisor in conversations with my daughter. I watched him suggest, twice, that I might want to consider bringing in a professional management team to run operations, that I was getting to an age where the day-to-day might be a lot. I watched one daughter start using his language. asset optimization, exit strategy, legacy planning, in ways that didn't sound like her. I also watched the numbers. My company, by that point, operated 4 warehousing facilities across East Tennessee and had annual revenues just under $40 million. I had been approached 3 times over the previous decade by regional logistics conglomerates looking to acquire. I had declined all 3 times because I intended to pass it on to my daughter if she ever wanted it. That had always been the plan. Ruth and I had talked about it. What I started to notice slowly was that Dominic had been doing research. The kind of research you do when you're planning something. He'd had conversations with 2 of my long-term facility managers. I found out from one of them, a man named Skip, who'd been with me for 12 years and felt uncomfortable enough to mention it to me. Dominic had been asking questions about my health, about my travel schedule, about whether I had any plans to sell in the near term. It was mapping the territory. I hired a private investigator in March of 2022. I didn't tell my daughter. I didn't tell anyone. I paid out of a personal account I'd had since before I was married, that she didn't know existed. Not because I was hiding money, but because Ruth had always said every person needed one account that was just theirs, for emergencies, for freedom, for whatever. It had about $60,000 in it. I used $14,000. What the investigator found took about 4 months to piece together. Dominic had been in quiet discussions with a private equity group based in Charlotte, a firm that specialized in acquiring family-owned logistics businesses in the Southeast. The discussions had started approximately 8 months after Ruth's death. He had represented himself in at least 2 documented conversations as having significant influence over the ownership timeline and succession planning of my company. He had used the phrase, management transition anticipated within 24 months. I was 62 years old. He had already scheduled my exit. There was also a financial matter. Several years earlier, I had made an informal loan documented with a simple promissory note of $240,000 to help him acquire a commercial property during a short period when his development company had a cash flow gap. He had assured me, and my daughter had passed along the assurance, that it would be repaid within 18 months. That was 4 years ago. He had never made a single payment. I went back to Patsy with everything the investigator had gathered. She reviewed it over a weekend and called me Sunday evening. "You have a case," she said, "and I think we should also talk to someone at the U.S. Attorney's office, because some of what you're describing, the misrepresentation to the equity group, may cross a line." I told her to make the calls. For the next 7 months, I went about my life exactly as I had before. I drove to the facilities. I attended my granddaughter's soccer games on Saturday mornings. I had Sunday dinner with my daughter and her husband twice a month and ate my food and listened to them talk and did not change my expression. My daughter asked me once that spring if I was doing okay. I told her I was fine. She said I seemed quiet. I told her I'd always been quiet. She laughed a little and said that was true. I thought about Ruth a lot during those months. She would have known something was wrong with me, the way she always knew. She had a quality, I don't know what else to call it, of seeing through whatever face I was wearing and finding the real one underneath. I missed that more than I can say, not being known by someone, having someone who could look at you and just know, but she wasn't there. So I kept the face on. The legal situation developed more slowly than Patsy had hoped. The civil case for repayment of the promissory note was straightforward. The federal matter involving potential wire fraud related to his misrepresentations to the equity group, using my company's name and implied authority, took longer to develop. The federal investigators were thorough and quiet, and they asked me not to discuss the matter with anyone. I didn't. The mediation was scheduled for October 14, 2023. It had been initiated by Dominic's attorney to address what they framed as a family business dispute regarding the future structure of the company and, in their words, obligations undertaken by George Whitfield in prior conversations, which was, as best Patsy could figure, an attempt to formalize some arrangement he believed I had verbally agreed to at some dinner table somewhere. I had not agreed to anything. I wore my Carhartt jacket because it was cool that morning and because it was the jacket I wore. I drove myself in my 2017 Ford F-150 with 140,000 miles on it. I got a large coffee at the drive-thru on the way and I drank half of it in the parking garage before I went in. The conference room was on the 14th floor of an office building in downtown Knoxville. Floor-to-ceiling windows, leather chairs, a long mahogany table that probably cost more than some of my warehouse equipment. Dominic's attorney, a man named something Hargrove. I remember the name from the letterhead, was already there when I arrived, arranging papers with the particular deliberateness of a man who wants you to notice how many papers he has. Dominic came in a few minutes later, my daughter beside him. He looked at my jacket. He didn't smirk. He was too controlled for that, but there was something in the set of his face, a relaxation, the look of a man who has assessed his opponent and found the assessment satisfying. The mediator opened the session and asked everyone to introduce themselves for the record. Dominic's attorney introduced himself, named his client, listed his firm's address. Patsy introduced herself. The mediator looked at me. And for the record, your full name and any relevant organizational affiliations. I said, George Allen Whitfield, principal owner and CEO of Whitfield Logistics Group, and as of September of this year, a cooperating witness in an active federal investigation being conducted by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Tennessee. The room went very still. Dominic's attorney stopped arranging his papers. My daughter looked up from her hands for the first time. Dominic's face did not go white. It went a particular kind of gray, the color of a man whose internal calculations are running very fast and coming up wrong. I'm sorry, the mediator said carefully. Could you repeat that last part? I repeated it. Patsy set a folder on the table. She slid a copy of a document across to Dominic's attorney without saying anything. He picked it up. He read the first page. He set it down. He leaned over and said something very quietly to Dominic. Dominic said nothing for almost 30 seconds. I counted. Then he asked to take a brief recess. We were in the hallway for 11 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when we stepped out, and again when we went back in. During those 11 minutes, my daughter came and stood next to me by the window at the end of the hall. She didn't say anything right away. We looked out at the Tennessee River below, the way it bends east past the old warehouse district, the part of the city I'd watched change over 30 years. How long? She finally said. How long have I known? About a year and a half. She didn't ask me why I hadn't told her. I think she understood why. Or maybe she wasn't ready to ask it yet. The money he borrowed from you, she said. It wasn't a question. $240,000. Promissory note dated March 2019. She closed her eyes. I wanted to put my arm around her. I didn't. I thought she might need a minute to be angry first, and she had a right to that. Is he going to be arrested? She asked. That's not for me to decide. The federal side of it is in the U.S. Attorney's hands. What happens here today is the civil matter. She nodded slowly. Dad, she said, and then stopped. I know, I said. When we went back in, Dominic's attorney made a brief statement indicating that his client wished to resolve the civil matters and that they would be withdrawing a petition regarding business structure entirely. Over the following 3 months, a consent judgment was entered for the full $240,000, plus 4 years of accrued interest at the statutory rate, plus Patsy's fees. The federal matter took another 8 months to fully develop. I won't go into the details because some of it is still subject to confidentiality obligations. What I can say is that Dominic's representations to the equity group in Charlotte were found to constitute wire fraud under federal statute. He accepted a plea agreement in the summer of 2024. He lost his Georgia real estate developer's license. His company was dissolved. My daughter filed for divorce in January of that year. The proceedings were not simple, but she had a good attorney and she was clear about what she wanted. She moved back to Knoxville with my granddaughter. They live about 12 minutes from me now. On Saturday mornings, I pick up my granddaughter for soccer. She's 8 years old and takes the sport very seriously. She has Ruth's eyes, the same particular shade of brown that I still sometimes look for in a room without meaning to. After the games, we usually get pancakes at a diner near the field. She gets hers with strawberries and an unreasonable amount of whipped cream, and she talks the entire time about whatever is occupying her mind that week. Last month it was volcanoes. The week before that, it was why dogs dream. I listened to every word. I kept the company. I have no current plans to sell, though I've had 2 more acquisition inquiries in the past year. Patsy reviews everything that crosses my desk now. Not because I've become paranoid, but because I've become paranoid, but because I've become careful, which is different. There's a version of caution that closes you off and a version that keeps you queer. I try to practice the second kind. The Carhartt jacket is still in my closet. The left cuff is still frayed. I thought sometimes about replacing it. I could afford to. But there's something I still like about it. The way it fits, the way it's shaped to me after all these years, the way nobody looks at it and thinks it's anything more than what it appears to be. That's fine with me. I've never needed anyone to look at what I'm wearing to know what I'm worth. I learned that from my father, who worked 40 years at a paper mill in Cookville, and never once raised his voice to prove a point. I learned it from Ruth, who never needed a single expensive thing and was the most substantial person I've ever known. And I suppose I learned it, in a different way, from a man in cufflinks on a Tuesday morning who looked at my jacket and decided he already knew everything he needed to know about me. He was wrong about that. But I hope, wherever he ends up, that he finds some way to build something real. Something that doesn't depend on what you can take from someone else. Because I know what it feels like to build something real, and there is nothing else like it. That's why I'd want him to know, if I could say one thing, that, and the fact that I've had that jacket since 2009, and I'm not getting rid of it anytime soon. I still drive past the old warehousing facility on Lovell Road sometimes, the first one I ever built, just to look at it. Not out of pride exactly, more the way you glance at a scar, not because it hurts anymore, but because it reminds you of something true about yourself. Dominic looked at my jacket and saw the whole story he needed, and I understand that, in a way I didn't when I was younger. People size up what's in front of them and they make their call. That's human. But what he missed, what that kind of thinking always misses, is that the jacket and the man wearing it are 2 entirely different things. I've thought a lot about why it unfolded the way it did. Not in a bitter way, more like trying to understand the mechanics of it, the way a machinist looks at a broken part to figure out where the stress fracture started. Dominic was not a stupid man. That's what people get wrong when they hear a story like this. They assume the other person must have been foolish or obvious. He wasn't. He was capable and strategic, and he had built real things in his life. But somewhere along the way, he had decided that the fastest path to what he wanted ran through someone else's work rather than his own. And once you make that choice, once you stop measuring your progress by what you can redirect rather than what you can build, you stop developing the parts of yourself that actually last. What I had and what he underestimated wasn't just a legal position. It was 31 years of learning how to think clearly under pressure. Of sitting across tables from people who wanted something from me and not showing my hand. Of being wrong sometimes and absorbing it and adjusting. That kind of judgment doesn't come from a degree or a salary or a suit. It accumulates slowly through 10,000 small decisions where you either do the right thing or you don't. Ruth understood that. She used to say that integrity isn't what you do when someone's watching, it's what you do when the outcome won't be known for 10 years. I kept the promissory note in a file because that was the right thing to do, not because I planned to use it. I hired Patsy because she was honest with me, not because she told me what I wanted to hear. Those choices didn't feel strategic at the time. They just felt like the right way to run your life. And the endurance it took, those 7 months of Sunday dinners and soccer games and saying nothing, it wasn't easy. There were nights I wanted to pick up the phone and say what I knew, but patience isn't passivity. Sometimes staying quiet and staying prepared is the most active thing you can do. My granddaughter asked me once what I was thinking about when I get quiet at breakfast. I told her I was just listening. She accepted that completely, the way 8-year-olds accept things, and went back to her pancakes. That's enough for me. That she grows up knowing that quiet doesn't mean weak, that an old jacket doesn't tell you anything about the person inside it, and that the most important things you build in this life are the ones nobody can take from you in a conference room on the 14th floor. I've still got the jacket.